Think about the last postcard you received. Maybe it was from a friend's vacation, a picture of a sunset over the ocean, a famous building, or a majestic mountain range. Postcards are a little thing, a way to say, I'm here and I wish you were here. They're happy memories sent through the mail. Now, what if I told you that, during a dark period in American history, one of the most popular postcards, printed and sold by the thousands, featured a burning body? This is not a product of a sick imagination. This is a real business. The lynching postcards. On the back of this postcard, a man wrote to his family, "This is the barbecue we had last night." He even drew an arrow pointing to a man in the crowd and wrote, "This is me, right next to the tree." How did a nation get to a point where murder became a souvenir? How did the brutal torture of a human being become a barbecue? This is not a story about a few monsters hiding in the shadows. This is a story about a monster living in broad daylight, encouraged by your neighbors, your friends, and your family. This is the story of the Ku Klux Klan, and the truth about their horrors is much more public than you've ever heard. When we think of the KKK, the image that comes to mind is of white-robed figures sneaking around in the dead of night, secret meetings in the woods, covert murders. That's the story we're told. A story about a radical group on the fringes of society. But that's a lie, or at least it's not the whole truth. The truth is far more horrifying. At its height, the Klan's terror was no secret. It was on display. It was organized. It was advertised. And most terrifyingly, it was celebrated. To understand this, we must talk about one of their most powerful weapons, the, quote, spectacle lynching. This was not a quick and quiet hanging. This was an elaborate spectacle, a ritual of brutality, designed not to kill one man, but to terrorize millions. Let's dissect such a festival of death. It usually starts with an accusation. Sometimes it's a serious crime, but more often it's something ridiculously trivial. A black man not stepping off the curb fast enough when a white woman walks by. A black farmer arguing with a white man about prices. Or, most famously, a baseless accusation of a black man looking at a white woman. The accusation required no evidence. In the racial hierarchy of the South, the word of a white person, no matter who they were, was always worth more than the life of a black person. Once the accusation was made, the news spread like wildfire. It was reported in the local newspapers. The Negro XYZ has been arrested for insulting Mrs. ABC. A party will be held at the old oak tree on the outskirts of town at dusk. All interested citizens are invited. Sometimes special trains were even arranged to bring spectators from neighboring counties. Do you hear that? That's not the language of justice, that's the language of a social event. And the crowds would come, hundreds, sometimes thousands, whole families. Parents would bring their children, seeing it as a lesson, a warning. Street vendors would set up, selling lemonade and snacks. The atmosphere would not be the gloom of an execution, but the excitement and eagerness of a festival. This is the most horrifying detail, the normalization of evil. These people are not psychopaths. They are farmers, shopkeepers, mechanics, your neighbors. They are people who go to church on Sunday mornings. But in the crowd, they become something else. Psychologists call it de-individuation. When you are part of an angry mob, personal responsibility evaporates. The mob empowers you to do things you would never dare do alone. The mob turns cruelty into a socially acceptable act. And then, the victim will be brought out. Death never comes quickly. That's not the point. The point is the ultimate pain, the absolute humiliation. It's a show, and it has to last. Victims would be tortured. The details of what happened are hard to put into words, but we must face them. They would be beaten with sticks and chains. They would be mutilated while still alive. Sometimes they would be castrated. A deeply symbolic act, a direct attack on the black man's sexuality and heritage, born of a morbid fear of racial mixing. After hours of torture, when the victim was near death, the final act of the play would take place. They might be shot hundreds of times by the crowd, each wanting a piece of the killing. Or, more commonly, they would be hanged. But even death is not the end. The body would usually be burned on a huge pyre, with a crowd cheering. And when the fire died down, the most terrifying thing would happen. People would gather around. They would fight over souvenirs, a piece of charred bone, a link from a rope, a piece of cloth from the victim's pants. Why? Why would a human want to keep a piece of a nightmare? Because that souvenir is a piece of evidence. It says, I was there, I participated, I am part of this power. It turns a viewer into an accomplice. And then there were the postcards. Photographers would be present at most of these public executions. They would take pictures of everything: the crowds, the torture scenes, the hanging bodies, even the smiling participants. These pictures would be printed in bulk and sold on the spot or in local stores the next day. This was not just an act of murder. This was a tool of systematic terror. Each postcard sent was a warning. It sent a message to every black community across the country. It said, this is where you stand. Don't forget it. Don't try to vote. Don't try to open a business that competes with white people. Don't look the wrong way. Because we, your white neighbors, could do this to you at any time, and we'd be smiling while we did it. It also sent a message to the justice system. The local sheriff was often present at the lynchings, sometimes even lighting the pyre. Judges, lawyers, and politicians were also in the mob. Who would investigate a murder in which the whole town participated? Who would convict a murderer when they themselves were one of them? The answer? No one. Of the thousands of recorded lynchings, only a tiny percentage of the participants were punished. The mob had become the law. So here's the first truth about the Klan. Their most terrifying weapon wasn't darkness or secrecy, it was daylight. It was public approval. It was the ability to turn a brutal act of murder into a family picnic. They succeeded in convincing millions of Americans that cruelty was not only necessary, but a legitimate form of entertainment. But this public spectacle, however powerful, is only one tool in their arsenal of terror. A spectacle needs a crowd, needs light, needs a victim you can touch. What about the terror that operates in the dark? The fear that creeps under your door when you're alone? The Klan understood that for every person they killed in the town square, they could terrorize thousands without anyone seeing them. They have perfected a different kind of terror, a terror built from whispers, symbols, and the sound of hooves in the stillness of the night. They have made themselves ghosts, and they have made an entire nation fear the dark. Overt violence is a message, a brutal message written in blood and fire for all to see. But the most effective messages are not always the loudest. Sometimes the scariest threats are whispered in the dark. The Ku Klux Klan understood this better than anyone. They were masters of psychological warfare. They knew that the ultimate goal was not to kill all your enemies. That was impossible. The real goal was to control them, and you can't control a dead man. But a man who lives in fear, you can make him do anything. A terrified man won't vote. He won't demand a fair wage. He won't hold his head up high. He'll chain himself to his own house. This was the core of the Klan's second, quieter, but perhaps even more sinister strategy, to instill a total terror, a fear that seeped into every aspect of life, turning every night into a waiting nightmare. And the main tool for this was their most iconic figure, the Night Riders. During the chaotic Reconstruction period after the Civil War, when the KKK first emerged, they built a legend. They didn't want to be seen as Confederate veterans bitter over their defeat. No, they wanted to be something more sinister, something more supernatural. They called themselves the ghosts of dead soldiers, returned from hell to exact vengeance. And everything they do is a carefully calculated show to reinforce that myth. Imagine you are a newly emancipated African-American family living in an isolated log cabin in rural Georgia. The night is quiet, except for the chirping of crickets. Suddenly you hear it, the distant sound of horseshoes, but not ordinary horseshoes. They move strangely, in a coordinated way, and they are getting closer. And then you see them, a procession of people dressed head to toe in white, mounted on horses covered in white, moving in an eerie silence. Their pointed hats point to the sky, an unnatural, inhuman shape. They say nothing, they just circle your house, a procession of ghosts. The silence is perhaps more terrifying than the screams. Then suddenly the silence was broken. A horn blew. the wild screams of the rebels, gunfire into the air. Threats were shouted through the cloth, covering their faces, voices muffled and unrecognizable. They even used theatrical tricks to exploit superstition. A Klansman might approach a house and ask for a drink of water. When the homeowner handed him a bucket, he would drain it, then ask for more, and then another bucket. Finally, he would say in a ghostly voice, "Thank you. I have not had a drop since I died at the Battle of Shiloh." He had a leather bag hidden under his cloak to hold the water, but to a terrified citizen, he was a veritable ghost, a bottomless spirit from hell. Another trick involved a prosthetic hand attached to a retractable stick, hidden in the sleeve of his shirt. He would sit on horseback and extend his hand to shake hands. When the victim reached out, the disembodied hand would stretch out in an unnatural manner. These stories may sound absurd to us today, but you have to put them in perspective. They were a community of recently ex-slaves, many of them illiterate, living in a world rife with folk tales of ghosts and spirits. To them, these night riders were not neighbors in disguise. They were a supernatural force. They were the embodiment of white rage, empowered by the other world. But the Klan's psychological warfare didn't stop when the sun came up. It was a campaign that went on day and night, using powerful symbols to instill fear. The most powerful symbol is the burning cross. We need to understand the profound evil of this act. The cross, for millions of people, is a symbol of love, sacrifice, and redemption. The Klan took that sacred symbol and weaponized it. They turned its meaning upside down, turning it into a symbol of hate, a death threat. Imagine you and your family are asleep. You are awakened by the flickering light outside your window and the smell of burning kerosene. You look outside and see a giant cross burning on your front lawn. The flames dance in the darkness. It is not just an act of vandalism. It is a message. It says, "We know where you are. We can reach you at any time. No place is safe. Not even your God can save you from us, because we are God's army." Beyond the cross, there are more direct threats. One morning you might find a letter pinned to your door. Inside is a crude drawing of a coffin or a hanged man, along with the words, "Leave before it's too late." The horror has moved from the fields to your doorstep. And that terror extended to your livelihood. It was economic terrorism. The Klan understood that to control a community, you had to keep it poor and dependent. If a black man opened a successful store that competed with white stores, he would get a visit from the night riders. His store would be burned to the ground. His customers would be threatened. They pressured white landowners not to lease their land to black farmers. They intimidated factory owners not to hire black workers, except for the dirtiest manual jobs. The goal was to ensure that African Americans would never be able to achieve economic independence, forever stuck at the bottom of the social ladder. But perhaps the most sinister thing about the Klan's strategy was that it widened the circle of terror. It wasn't just blacks who were targeted. Anyone who helped them, anyone who sided with them, became a target. During Reconstruction, they preyed on whites who had come from the North, whom they derogatorily called carpetbaggers. Many of these were teachers, activists, and government officials who genuinely wanted to help rebuild the South on a more equal footing. To the Klan, they were dangerous invaders. They also preyed on Southern whites who supported equal rights for blacks. They called them scalawags, traitors to their race. And they waged a brutal war against education. They targeted white teachers, especially women from the North, who dared to come to the South to open literacy schools for black children. Why? Because they knew that education was the path to freedom. A person who could read, write, and think was harder to control. Burning down a school was as much a part of their strategy as a lynching. It sent a clear message. Ignorance was a tool for maintaining power, and anyone who tried to bring the light of knowledge would be crushed. In this way, the Klan created a climate of total terror. They made everyone afraid. Blacks feared whites. Whites feared other whites. Everyone feared the dark. Everyone feared speaking their minds. But all these horrors, the public executions, the night riders, the burning crosses, the threats, raise a haunting question. How could they get away with it? How could a group commit thousands of acts of murder, arson, and assault, often in full view of everyone, over decades, without being stopped? The answer is perhaps the most terrifying truth of all. The Klan is not just a demonic army that lurks in the night. They are men you see every day. They don't just break the law. They are the law. To understand their true power, you have to understand that the man in the white robe at midnight may be the same man in the black robe in the courtroom the next morning. The KKK itself has a name, the Invisible Empire. The name has two meanings. On the surface, it refers to their ghostly appearance, to their ghosts in the night. But the deeper, more real meaning is about their hidden power, an empire that operates alongside the government, an invisible network that controls the visible power structures of society. The KKK's most enduring and terrifying success lay not in its acts of terrorism, but in its ability to infiltrate, corrupt, and control the very institutions designed to protect citizens. Let's start at the front lines. Law enforcement. Imagine a scenario. A black family is attacked by the night riders. The door is broken down, the father is beaten, the mother is humiliated. They survive the night. The next morning, the father, with all the courage he has left, runs to the sheriff's office for help. And as he walks in, the man behind the desk, the one with the star of law and order, looks up. And the father recognizes those eyes. He recognizes that voice. It's the same man who attacked his family last night. Can you imagine the terror and utter despair of that moment? The only place you could go for protection was the enemy's lair. There was no one to call. No help was coming. You were completely alone. This is not an exaggerated example. It is a reality in countless communities across the South. Police and sheriffs not only turned a blind eye to Klan crimes, they were often active members, even leaders. Let's go back to those public lynchings we were talking about. How could a mob drag a prisoner out of the county jail so easily? Because the sheriff was usually the one who opened the door for them. Sometimes a little drama would be staged. The sheriff would claim that the mob had overpowered him, but in reality he would often just stand aside or even actively hand the victim over to the mob. This was not a failure of law enforcement. This was complicity in the execution of terror. If there is an investigation, where will it go? Evidence mysteriously disappears. Witnesses are threatened into silence. Reports are falsified. The system is designed to protect criminals, not victims. But the infiltration doesn't stop at the local police. It climbs the upper echelons of power. It enters the courtroom. Even if a Klan case did go to court, what would happen? The victim would face a judge who might be a Klan member. The jury would be an all-white group, and there would almost certainly be many who were Klan members or sympathizers. Imagine such a trial. A black victim, lucky enough to survive an attack, would have to tell his story in front of a room full of hostile faces. His testimony would be mocked. He might be insulted by the defense attorney, even accused of causing the attack. And in the end, the jury would take just a few minutes to return a verdict. Not guilty. The attackers would walk out of the courtroom as heroes, cheered by friends and neighbors. This is no longer justice. This is an abuse of the law, turning the court into a stage to legitimize hatred. And then, in the 1920s, the Invisible Empire decided to step into the light. In its second incarnation, the KKK became a huge political force. They were no longer a phenomenon confined to the South. They spread across the country, gaining strength in states like Indiana, Oregon, and Colorado. How did they do it? By changing their strategy. They didn't just sell hatred of black people. They expanded their list of enemies, immigrants, Catholics, Jews. They wrapped their message in the banner of patriotism and faith. They declared themselves the defenders of 100% Americanism, defending white Protestant values against foreign influences. And the message worked. Millions of Americans joined. The KKK became a socialist organization. They held large daytime parades, with tens of thousands of members dressed in white robes marching through major avenues in cities, including Washington, D.C. They held family picnics and beauty pageants. With that mass power, they began to seize political power. They no longer just put people in police chiefs. They ran for office themselves. They put people on school boards, city councils. They elected mayors, governors, senators. Take Indiana, for example. By the mid-1920s, the Klan had virtually taken control of the state government. The governor, Edward L. Jackson, was a Klan member. More than half of the seats in the state legislature were held by Klan members. What does this mean in practice? It means that state laws, government contracts, and appointed positions all serve the Klan's agenda. It means that education funds can be used to advance their ideology. It means that the state, with all its power, has become an instrument of hate. The invisible empire has become visible. This infiltration was only possible because it was accepted by a large segment of the white community. To many, the Klan was not a terrorist group. It was a social club, a patriotic fraternal organization. Many Protestant ministers were Klan members and preached their ideology from their pulpits. The Klan had successfully twisted the message of patriotism and Christianity into a weapon to justify brutality. So with this immense power, with control of both the law and the apparatus that enforced it, what did the Klan do? We know they terrorized African Americans. But their ambitions were much larger. They wanted more than just to enforce a racial hierarchy. In their minds, they were the saviors of America's soul, the guardians of a specific and narrow moral vision. They set themselves up as judge, jury, and executioner, not only in matters of race, but also in matters of personal conduct. And their crusade to enforce this morality will unleash a special kind of cruelty, directed at those they see as the weakest links in their perfect white society, women. Once you control the police, the judges, and the politicians, you can do anything. The Klan's power was limitless. It was no longer just a band of racial terrorists. By the 1920s, it had taken on a new mantle: guardians of morality, holy warriors for the soul of white America. In their twisted ideology, the enemy is not just blacks, Jews, or Catholics. The enemy is also the moral decay that is eating away at society from within. Alcohol, gambling, and above all, the changing role of women. The Klan worshipped an idealized image of the, quote, pure white woman. In their eyes, white women were symbols of purity, racial treasures that needed to be protected. But this protection came at a price. It demanded absolute obedience. Any woman who stepped outside their narrow moral framework was no longer considered a, quote, treasure. She became a traitor, a stain on the purity of the race, and needed to be publicly and shamefully punished. And so the Klan opened a new front of terror, a secret war against the very women it claimed to protect. Who was their victim? It could be a woman suspected of adultery, a divorced wife, something considered disgraceful, a woman rumored to have bootlegged during Prohibition, or simply a woman who was too independent, too outspoken, someone who did not conform to the traditional rules of wife and motherhood. The accusation, as usual, required no evidence, just a rumor, a denunciation from a jealous neighbor. And the punishment is always brutal. Imagine a night. A group of men in white coats burst into your house. They are no longer ghosts, they are neighbors, acquaintances, but now their eyes burn with a moral zealotry. They drag a woman out of her house, ignoring the cries of her children. They take her to a secluded spot, perhaps a forest or a deserted bridge, and there they will perform their punishment ritual. The most common punishment was flogging. They would tie her to a tree, rip off her clothes, and whip her back with thick leather whips. Each blow was more than just physical pain. It was an act of humiliation, stripping her of her dignity in front of those who felt they had the right to judge her. But there was an even more gruesome punishment, one that seemed to exist only in medieval nightmares: tarring and feathering. We need to understand the horror of this act. The tar here is not the asphalt we see on the streets. It is molten pine resin, boiled. They would strip the victim naked and pour the burning liquid all over their body. The pain was unimaginable, like being burned alive. The skin would blister and peel off immediately. And as the victim writhed in pain, they would throw chicken feathers at them. The feathers would stick to the tar, transforming the victim into a hideous half-bird, half-man creature. The goal was not to kill. Although many of the victims later died from severe burns and infection, the goal was the ultimate humiliation. They would turn a person into a laughingstock, a monster to be mocked. Then they would parade the victim through town, or simply leave them there, alone in the dark, to suffer and be humiliated. Why do they do this? Because it reinforces their power in two ways. First, it terrorizes other women, forcing them to conform to rigid social norms. Second, and more importantly, it reinforces white male dominance. It sends a message that women's bodies, women's morality, and women's lives are all under the control of men in the community. In this way, the Klan perfected its terror machine. It combined the public brutality of lynchings, the supernatural fear of the Night Riders, the corruption of the public office, and the harsh moral control into a comprehensive system of oppression. They have attacked blacks to maintain racial superiority. They have attacked immigrants and other religions to maintain cultural superiority. And they have attacked women to maintain male superiority. All are different sides of the same war, a war against change, against equality, and against the future of America itself. This is the true legacy of the Ku Klux Klan. It is not just a sad chapter in history, it is a warning about how easily hatred, disguised as patriotism and faith, can poison a nation. It shows how ordinary people, our neighbors, can become cruel when they believe they are serving a noble cause. And it reminds us that the invisible empire never really went away, it just changed its cloak. Ideas of superiority, intolerance, and the use of violence to impose one's will on others still exist, lurking in various forms in our society today. The story of the KKK is not a story about monsters. It is a story about humanity and about the deep darkness that can exist within each of us.